The 20th century was a wilderness of gloom and murders were frequent. In the late 1970s, 5 young girls were brutally murdered in the space of just 5 months. It was the summer of 1979 in and around Los Angeles, especially near the San Gabriel Mountains. It was a beautiful setting, close to the coastline. People were playing in the soft sunshine. But the toolbox killers have shattered the quiet and peaceful atmosphere of this area. They committed chilling crimes of kidnapping, rape, and murder. The toolbox killers was the nickname given to Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. This is because they used a toolbox containing various tools to torture their victims, such as plastic tape, pliers, rope, screwdrivers. What was particularly outrageous was that they used cameras and tape recorders to document their victims. Although the horror story of the toolbox killers has now ended, the shadow they cast on people is hard to forget. It is well known that most murders are caused by money, jealousy, hatred, and other factors. But most serial killers are the result of a tragic childhood experience or a natural antisocial personality. Lawrence Bittaker was born on September 27, 1940, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is a jewel of a city located at the confluence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers. It is a city of picturesque landscapes, rich in culture and history. At one point in time, Pittsburgh was nicknamed the steel capital of the world. Lawrence Bittaker came into the world after being abandoned by his parents. He was later adopted by George and Mrs. George Bittaker. Because George worked in an airplane factory, the family had to move around a lot. From Pennsylvania, they traveled to Florida, then Ohio, and finally settled in California. It is important to mention that Lawrence Bittaker was tested for his IQ and scored around 138. This score means that his IQ level exceeds that of 98% of the world's population. As a youth, Lawrence Bittaker was often arrested by the police for minor offenses. These offenses included stealing items, such as stealing something from a store while someone was not expecting it, and engaging in fights, possibly with others in the schoolyard or on the street. However, because he was so young, the law gave him a wide berth and did not punish him substantially and harshly. After several arrests, however, the high school he attended expelled him so that his bad behavior would not affect the school's reputation. He was about 17 years old at the time. After this, Lawrence Bittaker's criminal behavior escalated. On one occasion, he stole a car and drove it recklessly on the road. When the police noticed his offense and tried to stop him, he went so far as to lose his mind that he increased his horsepower and recklessly forced his way out of the police circle. In the course of his arrest, he uttered abusive language, constantly abused the police, and tried to resist arrest. In this incident, he committed 3 unforgivable offenses: car theft, evading arrest, and hit and run. At first, he was incarcerated in the California Youth Authority, where he had a difficult time. After serving his sentence, he was then arrested by the Louisiana FBI for violating the Interstate Motor Vehicle Theft Act. After a trial, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison to be served at a federal prison in Oklahoma. Later, due to his good behavior in prison, he was granted a transfer to an unknown medical center in Missouri. It is said that his first sexual experience took place at this medical center. However, he was tight-lipped about the experience and did not disclose any further details. However, after only 6 months in prison, he was released early, perhaps because of his outstanding performance. It is important to note that Lawrence Bittaker's foster parents never coached him to commit crimes. At his first trial, the foster parents even publicly stated that they had never adopted the boy. A year later, Lawrence Bittaker turned 20. At that age, he should have been full of hope and vigor, but instead he was once again arrested by the police for robbery in Los Angeles. This time, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison in the state penitentiary. In this prison, there is a specialized psychiatric test designed to assess the mental condition of inmates. However, the results of Lawrence Bittaker's psychiatric evaluation were shocking. He was diagnosed as a paranoid maniac with an extremely strong desire to be in control and the ability to skillfully hide his true inner thoughts. Despite this, after 3 years, he was paroled. But just 2 months later, he was incarcerated again. This time for a parole violation and a suspected robbery. A new psychiatric test revealed that he was a borderline psychopath. The main features of this type of psychosis are chronically unstable patterns of interpersonal relationships, distorted self-concept, and intense emotional reactions. This meant that he was completely unable to control his behavior and emotions, and could fall into a state of madness at any time. A year later, Lawrence Bittaker was released from prison again. 3 years later, he was arrested for burglary and a hit-and-run accident and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Surprisingly, He was released in April 1970, but he was not released. Just a year later, however, he was arrested again for burglary and parole violation and sentenced to 6 months to 15 years in prison. This time, however, he served only 3 years. A few months later, Lawrence Bittaker was arrested again and incarcerated at the California Men's Prison Colony in San Luis Obispo. This time, the charge was attempted murder under extremely aggravating circumstances. What happened was that, at the time, he was sneaking around the supermarket, stealing a steak. In order to make it out of the supermarket, he hid the steak in his pants. But his behavior did not escape the eyes of the supermarket employees. An attentive supermarket employee noticed his unusual behavior. When the employee bravely followed him to the parking lot outside the supermarket and tried to stop him, he was so heartless that he stabbed the other person with a knife. While serving his prison sentence, Lawrence Bittaker underwent psychiatric testing again. One of the prison psychiatrists rejected the previous view that he was borderline psychotic and instead concluded that he had an antisocial personality and was a classic sociopath. Another psychiatrist thought he was a very mature psychopath. While in prison, Lawrence Bittaker met another member of the Toolbox Killers, Roy Norris. Roy Norris was born on February 5, 1948 in Greeley, Colorado. He spent his childhood moving back and forth between his biological family and a foster home. According to unconfirmed gossip, he was not only neglected in these homes, but even sexually abused in one of them. Roy Norris also dropped out of high school, but then joined the Navy. He spent most of his service time in San Diego and also served 4 months in Vietnam. However, he was diagnosed by a military psychologist as suffering from a severe personality disorder and was forcibly discharged. When Roy Norris returned to San Diego, he was arrested in November 1969 for attempted rape. 3 months later, he was released on bail pending trial. In May 1970, while still on bail, he attacked a female student on the San Diego State University campus. He swooped down on the woman from behind and struck her hard on the head with a rock, then slammed her head against the concrete several times. Since the victim was lucky to survive, he was only charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Roy Norris was then convicted and sent to Atascadero State Hospital, classified as a mentally disturbed sex offender, where he spent 5 long years. In 1975, he was paroled and declared no further danger to others. However, just 3 months later, he was arrested again for dragging a 27-year-old woman into the bush and raping her. He was convicted of rape and sent to the California Men's Prison Colony in San Luis Obispo. It was here that he met and became friends with Lawrence Bittaker. Roy Norris told Lawrence Bittaker that his greatest love was shocking women with fear and terror, and Lawrence Bittaker said that if he assaulted a woman, he would kill her to avoid leaving witnesses. There, together, they fantasized about sexually assaulting and murdering young girls, vowed to reunite once they were released, and planned to murder a girl between the ages of 13 and 19 every 10 days or so. In November 1978, Lawrence Bittaker was released from prison and moved to Los Angeles. In turn, Roy Norris was released from prison on January 15, 1979, and moved to Los Angeles. Upon learning of Roy Norris's release, Lawrence Bittaker immediately wrote to him, and the infamous The Toolbox Killers were about to begin their bloodshed. The two men met and set their evil plans in motion. As kidnapping young girls was not an easy task, Lawrence Bittaker offered to buy a van, and Roy Norris paid for it. In February 1979, they bought a silver GMC Vandura, which they nicknamed Murder Mac. Over the next few months, they picked up more than 24 hitchhiking girls, but they didn't do it. They were just practicing, and they couldn't find the right place to do it. Then they found a fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains that was so bad and had so few people that they thought it would be a safe place. In making their final preparations, they bought a torture kit, along with plastic tape, pliers, rope, screwdrivers, an ice pick, and a Polaroid camera and tape recorder. Immediately thereafter, the crimes began. On June 24, 1979, they abducted their first victim, 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer, a pretty little girl. Near Redondo Beach, Roy Norris forced her into a van, sealed her mouth with plastic tape, and tied her hands and feet. Lawrence Bittaker drove the van to a fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains, a virtually deserted area. There, they violated Lucinda Schaefer, wrapping a coat hanger around her neck and securing it with pliers to suffocate her. Her body was then wrapped in a plastic shower curtain and thrown into a nearby ravine. On July 8th, they picked up a hitchhiker, 18-year-old Andrea Hall, while Roy Norris was hiding in the van and Lawrence Bittaker persuaded her to get in. Once she was in the van, Roy Norris taped her mouth with plastic tape and tied her hands and feet with rope. After Lawrence Bittaker drove the van down a nearby side road, they assaulted her and took several photographs. Andrea Hall, not giving up hope, broke free and escaped when they went to get a beer, but was recaptured before she got very far. Lawrence Bittaker stabbed her with an ice pick and Roy Norris strangled her. Her body was also thrown off a cliff. On September 3rd, they were looking for prey near Hermosa Beach when they spotted two girls on a bus stop bench. Roy Norris lied and offered them a ride, and 15-year-old Jackie Gilliam and 13-year-old Leah Lamp accepted. When Lawrence Bittaker pulls up near a suburban tennis court, the girls become suspicious, and Leah Lamp tries to get out of the bus through the back door, but Roy Norris is on guard and hits her over the head with a baseball bat. With their cooperation, both girls were uniformed and tied up. Lawrence Bittaker drove his car onto the fire road and violated the girls, torturing them with wire and pliers and recording everything on a tape recorder. In the end, both girls were killed and their bodies thrown over a cliff. On September 30th, they abducted Shirley Sanders and violated her, but she escaped. She was able to report the attack, but could not recognize her attackers and did not remember the license plate number. On October 31st, 16-year-old Lynette Ledford was abducted. This time, it was not on a fire road, but in a car. For 2 hours, Lynette Ledford was painfully traumatized. Lawrence Bittaker also beat her with a hammer and tortured her with pliers because they like to hear their victims scream. Finally, they strangled Lynette Ledford with a wire, and this time they did not throw the body off the cliff, but left it on a lawn in Hermosa Beach because they wanted to see the reaction of the locals. After Lynette Ledford's murder, Roy Norris bragged about the murder to his friend Jimmy Dalton at a bar, who didn't believe him at first. When the body was found the next day, there was an uproar. The press nicknamed them the Toolbox Killers because they were thought to be construction workers. Upon seeing the news, Jimmy Dalton immediately told the LAPD. 2 officers then placed Roy Norris under surveillance and arrested him for possession of marijuana and parole violations. After a lengthy interrogation, Roy Norris confessed to the murders but said he was just a helper and that the real mastermind was Lawrence Bittaker, who also helped the police find the bodies of Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp. Eventually, at trial, Roy Norris was convicted of murder, kidnapping, rape, sexual deviance, and criminal conspiracy, but was sentenced to only 45 years in prison without parole for providing information, and he died of natural causes in a California hospital on February 25, 2020. Lawrence Bittaker was convicted of rape, kidnapping, and murder, and was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, he died of natural causes on December 13, 2019 at San Quentin State Prison. In fact, without Jimmy Dalton's help, the police would have spent a lot of time investigating. The reason for this is that most of the bodies of the victims were dumped at the bottom of the cliffs, and even if the families of the victims had called the police, it is likely that these cases would have turned into unsolved crimes as time went by. At the time, only Lynette Ledford's body was in the public eye. However, at that time, there was neither advanced DNA technology nor surveillance facilities, so the difficulty of solving the case was beyond imagination. Therefore, the success of solving this serial murder case in such a short period of time was all due to Roy Norris' bragging behavior. It was because of his bragging that the police were able to quickly apprehend the 2 murderers and save more potential victims at the same time. In just 4 months, they assaulted 6 young girls and brutally murdered 5 of them. It's really hard to imagine just how many innocent victims they would have ended up with if they hadn't been apprehended in time. Their psychological problems were mainly characterized by extremely severe antisocial personality disorder. The distinguishing feature of this personality disorder is a persistent disregard for the consequences of behavior, as well as the rights of others. Sufferers often engage in illegal, deceptive, exploitative, and reckless behavior to satisfy their own personal interests without remorse. They may justify or rationalize their actions, even blaming the victim, with no regard for the exploitative and harmful effects of their actions on others. Therefore, if you have a loved one or friend who suffers from this personality disorder, don't try to change them because they simply cannot understand their mistakes. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris behavior amply demonstrates a high level of impulsivity and aggression, a typical characteristic of antisocial personality disorder. Their behavior is unplanned and driven by chance motives, emotional impulses, or instinctive desires. They cause great harm to society, not only because of their criminal behavior, but also because of their extreme disregard for the lives of others. In addition, their behavior reveals an extreme desire for power and control, as well as a strong ability to manipulate and take advantage of others. They are likely to commit crimes to satisfy their own twisted sense of authority and control. This obsession with power and manipulative nature is a trait shared by many serial killers. During the course of their crimes, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris displayed a heinous propensity for extreme cruelty and abuse towards their victims. This may be related to the traumatic and neglectful experiences they suffered during their childhood. Their behavior may have been a distorted response to their early experiences, although this is not a defense to their criminal behavior by any means. Overall, Lawrence Bittaker's and Roy Norris' psychological problems are extremely complex and involve multiple aspects of antisocial personality disorder, including disregard for the rights of others, impulsivity and aggression, unplanned behavior, violation of social norms, and a distorted quest for power and control. Together, these characteristics build a psychological portrait of them as serial killers.